Welcome to The Explainer. Let's just jump right into it today because we're looking at a truly fascinating piece of ancient history tucked away in 1 Chronicles chapter 19. Now, if you were to just glance at this text, it honestly reads a bit like a dry military report. You've got diplomatic disputes, mercenary contracts, troop formations, the whole shebang. But if we look closer, right beneath all that ancient battle strategy, there's actually an incredibly relevant blueprint for surviving life's most unfair battles. So today, we're going to unpack how a simple act of goodwill sparked an absolutely massive war. And more importantly, we'll talk about how we can navigate those moments when our own good intentions are just completely trampled by the world.
To really wrap our heads around this, we have to look at who this history was actually written for. The Book of Chronicles wasn't just some casual recounting of facts. It was compiled for a very specific group, the exiles returning from captivity in Babylon. We're talking about people who had lost absolutely everything. Their homes were destroyed, and they were trying to rebuild their lives from literally scratch. And as they're standing there, looking at the rubble around them, they were asking this massive, heartbreaking question. Is God still our God? Are we still his people? To answer that, the author points them back to a specific story about King David, and it's a story not just about his bravery, but about ultimate sovereignty over our totally chaotic lives.
Section 1. Trampled goodwill and tragic misunderstanding. Interestingly enough, this massive conflict didn't actually start with an invasion at all. It started with a funeral. The king of the Ammonites, a guy named Nahash, had just passed away. Hearing this news, King David decides to send a diplomatic delegation over to Nahash's son, Hanun, to offer his condolences and, just comfort him in his grief. It was really an act of pure, unadulterated kindness. And the motivation behind David's kindness really comes down to this specific Hebrew word, hesed. Now, this isn't just doing someone a polite favor. Hesed means deep loyalty, mutual obligation, and covenant love. See, years earlier, when David was a fugitive running for his absolute life from King Saul, it was King Nahash who secretly supported him. And later on, during another rebellion, Nahash actually provided David with food and supplies. So David isn't just playing politics here. He's remembering a friend who had his back in his darkest hour. His delegation was sent out of genuine gratitude and deep, authentic hesed.
But man, here is where the tragedy strikes. Hanun's advisors look at David's delegation, and they completely, disastrously misread the situation. They start whispering in the new king's ear, basically convincing him, hey, these aren't mourners, they're spies sent to overthrow the city. And their reaction? It is brutally shocking. They capture David's men, shave off half of their beards, cut their garments right in half down to the buttocks, and just send them packing. Now, in the ancient Near East, a man's beard was the ultimate symbol of his dignity and honor. To shave half of it off and to expose them like that, it was an intentional, incredibly public humiliation. This wasn't just a simple misunderstanding, it was a devastating insult and a blatant declaration of war.
Which really makes you wonder, right? Have you ever extended a hand in pure kindness only to have it slapped away? Have you ever had your absolute best intentions completely misunderstood, twisted, or just thrown right back in your face? It happens everywhere. In our workplaces, our friendships, even our families. You try to do the right thing. You show up with hesed, and you're met with hostility and humiliation. In those moments, it is perfectly natural to look up and ask, why is this happening to me? It's a completely honest question. But as this piece of history shows us, a misunderstanding can escalate into something much, much larger.
Section 2. The massive threat of 1,000 talents. So, the Ammonites quickly realize they have made a terrible, terrible mistake. They know David is going to retaliate after his men were humiliated like that. But instead of sending an apology, instead of trying to clear the air, they decide to double down. They decide to prepare for a massive, all-out war.
And they do it by pulling out their checkbook. The Ammonites dropped 1,000 talents of silver to hire mercenary armies. To put that into perspective for a second, this is a staggering, mind-boggling amount of wealth. It represents the ultimate worldly flex of power and money. They were basically trying to buy their way out of the consequences of their own toxic behavior, using vast resources to crush the person they had just wronged.
And just look at what all that silver bought them. They assembled a genuinely terrifying mercenary coalition. We are talking about 32,000 chariots. In ancient warfare, chariots were the equivalent of modern-day tanks. On top of that, they hired the king of Mahaka's army, the seasoned warriors of Zobah, and stacked all of that on top of their own Ammonite forces. This brilliantly illustrates how sometimes, when we face opposition, it doesn't just come as a single, isolated challenge, does it? It comes as an overwhelming coalition. The world marshals its resources, its wealth, and its alliances to stand against what is right. It is a terrifying sight.
Section 3. Joab's bold two-front strategy.
So how on earth does Israel respond to this massive wall of armor and wealth? Enter Joab. He's King David's brilliant, battle-hardened commander. Joab marches the Israelite army out to meet the threat, but when he finally arrives at the battlefield, the situation is far, far worse than anyone could have imagined.
Joab takes one look at the field and realizes he has walked right into a death trap. Right in front of him, he's got the Ammonite army, heavily fortified and blocking the city gates. But then, he looks over his shoulder and he sees the RM mercenaries dominating the open fields right behind him. He is completely, totally surrounded, pinned between the gates and the fields, a literal two-front nightmare. This is exactly like that moment in life where you feel entirely trapped, where the pressure is coming from every single direction, and there seems to be absolutely no way out.
So what does Joab do? Well, he executes a brilliant, yet incredibly desperate tactical response. Step 1, he splits his already outnumbered army. Step 2, Joab takes the absolute elite, battle-tested forces and faces those daunting Aramon mercenaries out in the fields. And Step 3, he gives the remainder of the army to his brother Abishai and tells him to hold the line against the Ammonites at the gates. It is such a bold strategy. I mean, dividing an already smaller force to fight a war on two fronts simultaneously, that requires immense trust and flawless execution. Section 4. True Faith. Best Effort and Surrender. Now, right here is where our history lesson shifts from military tactics to something so much deeper. Joab knows that his clever little strategy isn't enough to guarantee a win against 32,000 chariots. Tactics are great, for sure, but in the face of literally impossible odds, you need something more.
And this brings us to the absolute emotional climax of the story. Right before they charge into battle, Joab looks at his brother and says, "May the Lord do what is good in his sight." I really want you to let that sink in for a second. Joab doesn't say, "We are definitely going to win this." He doesn't say, "My strategy is flawless." No, he says, "I have done everything in my human power, and now I am completely surrendering the ultimate outcome to God." This is the very definition of true faith. It's not some passive resignation. It's doing your absolute best, fighting with literally everything you have, and then having the profound peace to leave the final result in the hands of a higher power.
Section 5. The sovereign writes the ending. Because surrendering control is exactly what sets the stage for an ending that absolutely no one could have predicted. You see, when you surrender the pen to the sovereign, the story takes a monumental shift.
Let's walk through this incredible timeline of the enemy's downfall. On day 1, Joab charges, and those mighty Aram mercenaries, despite all their silver and all their chariots, they break rank and flee in terror. Seeing this, the Ammonites completely lose their nerve and retreat behind their city walls. But it wasn't over. Weeks later, Aram decides to try again. They actually cross the Euphrates, gathering even more massive reinforcements under a new commander named Shophak. This time, King David himself leads the army out. And in the final decisive battle, David's forces utterly crush the coalition. They defeat 7,000 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers. And the result? Complete and total surrender. 1 Chronicles 19:19 records that these exact same enemies, the ones who started this whole mess by humiliating David's men, ended up making peace and becoming servants to Israel. Which brings us to our final empowering takeaway for this explainer. We don't write the final sentence of our lives. God does. Think back to those returning exiles who first read this story. They felt defeated, they were surrounded by opposition, and they were wondering if their story was just over. But this history reminds us that no matter how unfairly you've been treated, no matter how terribly your good intentions have been misunderstood, and no matter how overwhelming those 1,000 talent forces aligned against you might seem, they do not have the final say. You do your best, you act with hesed, you fight with courage. But you can find absolute peace in knowing that the ultimate outcome of your life rests safely in sovereign hands. So ask yourself today, what unfair battle do you need to stop trying to control and finally surrender to the one who actually writes the ending? Keep learning, keep pushing forward, and I'll catch you on the next explainer.